Good morning, and welcome to our Unitarian Universalist Church of Sarasota and our Lakewood Ranch Unitarian Universalist, as well as our visitors. I'm the Reverend Doug Watkins, Interim Senior Minister. I'm joined today by the Reverend Budfriend Jones, who is assisting, and the Reverend Beth Miller, another one of our associates, who will be the lead for today's service. We also have Klaus Obermeit and Doug Caldwell assisting with our crucial technical support. Catherine Bonner will offer a time for all ages. And our music will be offered by Don Brin on the piano, Robert Laschetti, our music director, and our mass choir. If you are a visitor, we hope that you will take a moment before you leave today to go to our homepage and click on the welcome banner. That will take you to a page that gives you a lot of helpful information to get to know Unitarian Universalism and our congregation better. Also on that page, there is a place for you to sign our virtual guest book. If you do that, we will send you our newsletter, The Contact, which gives you a lot more information, and also all of the links for our various online services. I hope that you will take a few moments to do that before you leave. There will be a coffee hour after the service. That is the same link that you use for the morning forum. I hope you will join us there. Please remember that next week we will begin our services in person here in the sanctuary at 10:45. I hope that you will join us for that gathering as well. Finally, I have an important loss in our community that I want to take just a moment to honor and share with you. Many of you know this, but this week on Thursday, Louise Steinspring died, and it was a big loss to our community. I know that many of you were very close friends with her, and all of us that knew her will miss her creative and caring spirit and her generous laughter. We will plan a memorial service, so please stay tuned for when that service will come up. But just for a moment, may we hold her memory and her family and friends, and John especially, in our thoughts and prayers, just for a quiet moment together. May Louise's spirit live on in each of us. We will now receive the gift of our prelude.
This weekend, we want to honor our veterans especially. You have served in many places and in many roles. Many of you have served in dangerous circumstances and at great cost to yourselves and to your families. And so this weekend, collectively, we want to say to you a heartfelt thank you for your service. As we light the candle, the chalice, as we light the chalice today, we're going to use the words of Paul Sprecher. We light this chalice in honor, to honor the memory of those who have come before us, kindling flames of wisdom in dark times, willing to challenge orthodoxy even at great personal risk, giving us a legacy of freedom and a love of truth, a legacy that warms and lights our paths.
Today in our religious education Zoom class, we're going to be talking about those who came before us to pave the way for so many things that impact our lives. And as today's worship service is reflecting on racism, we wanted to share a short video that gives kind of a wake-up call and how those things that impact our lives can either help or hinder us. Please enjoy the video.
We are going to be running a race. However, your starting position in this race will be decided by the answers to questions that we are going to be asking you.
Sorry, what? It's a joke.
This activity is intended to explore how society favours one race over others.
People often confuse white privilege with being wealthy or being rich, and it isn't about that. What it's about is the absence of having to live with the consequences of racism.
Now, if the question applies to you, you will take a big step forward. If the answer to the question doesn't apply to you, you stay where you are.
I better win, man. Oh.
Okay, make sure you're on the start line. I see some cheaters already.
Yeah, bother.
Feet behind the line.
If English is your parents' first language, take a step forward.
Oh, yeah.
If you have ever been the only person in the room of your race, take a step backwards.
A bat? For God's sake!
If you've never been asked where you come from, take a step forward.
If you have never had to be worried about your family being stopped and searched, take a step forward.
I don't get worried about if people ask me to stop and search.
The divide widens, and the inequality of their position becomes clear.
This is just like not fair now.
Farah, none of us are white. None of us are white. It's unfair.
The last question. If your parents have ever warned you about racism, take a step backwards.
If we were about to start a race, is this a fair starting point for us all? No. Mackay, how do you feel standing there in the field of runners?
I kind of feel a bit alone. I can't really see. I'm literally just by myself, more or less. I'm just a bit frustrated and annoyed that society nowadays really isn't fair. And I just wish everybody could be equal.
Farah!
It's kind of frustrating that, like, me and Sarah are just standing at the back here while the majority of people who may be white are, like, standing right at the front. That just frustrates me a bit, because it's almost as in what society is today. I don't want this to be how it is, but it is, so it just gets a bit frustrating.
Henry, how are you feeling being right at the very front?
It feels quite weird because if you think about it, I think all of us should be at the same point, but sadly the questions, the ways that they were put didn't favour some people, which I think is quite unfair.
On your marks. Get set. Go!
Well, now I'd like you to join with our choir and all of us singing one of the favorite hymns of this church, When Our Heart is in a Holy Place, number 1008. For our time of centering, I shall read to you Let Us Be a People of Not Forgetting by Karen Johnston. Then we will have a period of silence, followed by our singing of Spirit of Life. As we gather this morning, let us be a people of not forgetting. Let us practice holding collective memories that might otherwise slip into that enormous void that sucks at and corrodes any future we hold. Let us practice honoring truth-telling up from the past that must come fully into the now, lest we falter and fall, lest the whole remain in pieces. Let not our need for comfort or simplicity, for easy forgiveness or false pardon smother the heartbreak that still needs healing. Let us practice resilience with reckoning. Let us marry memory with promise. Let us dance in the tension we find there. Let us rest in the integrity we cultivate there, let us be partners with the possibility that emerges there. It is good we gather. And now let us be in silence.
A reading in preparation for our sermon this morning is taken from the writing of Michelle L. Norris. Amnesia gets in the way of atonement in America, but amnesia is actually too benign a word because it sounds as though people just forgot about the horrors of slavery, forgot about people who were forced to work in the fields literally until their death, forgot that between 50,000 and 85,000 Africans died during their forced migration to this country, in the way that one forgets where they placed their keys or their passport. We've been through more than a willful forgetting. We've had instead an insidious effort to rewrite history. We've built monuments to traitors and raised large sums of money to place the names of generals who fought against their own country all over highways and civic buildings. We've allowed turncoats to become heroes. On a personal level, this false narrative about America is another act of cruelty, even a kind of larceny. Here ends the reading. Join us in hymn number 146, Soon the Day Will Arrive.
Children will smile when I'm wandering weather on share, you and me. Some have dreamed, some have died, to make a bright tomorrow, and our vision remains in our hearts. Now the torch must be passed with new hope, not in sorrow, and the promise to make a new start. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, you and me. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me.
Good morning, everyone. I look forward to being together with many of you next week when we open. That's very exciting news. Our Soul Matters theme for November is Holding History. Holding history. Not learning history, or remembering history, or writing about history. It's holding history. That's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? Holding history. What does it mean? How do we hold history? Well, my thoughts went to racism and white supremacy and all that we've been learning about the history of our country these last few years that we either didn't know or forgot or suppressed. Michelle Norris, the author of the reading we just heard from Doug, talks about amnesia getting in the way of atonement in America, and I certainly believe that's true. But she says amnesia is too benign a word. It sounds as though people just forgot about the horrors of slavery, forgot about people who are forced to work in the fields literally until their death, and forgot that between 50,000 and 85,000 Africans died during their forced migration to this country. And this kind of forgetting perpetuates those systems of oppression that our country was founded on, that were ensconced in law following the Civil War, and have significant consequences we live with still today. It's more of a willful forgetting, she writes, than amnesia. Now, I'm primarily talking to white people this morning. It's our failure to remember, our failure to learn, that maintains white supremacy and institutional racism. So it's on us, folks, we white people. And it's been pretty easy to have this kind of amnesia until the last few years. In the political uproar that began before President Obama was elected, that grew throughout his presidency, and in the overt and sometimes violent backlash that's been ignited and has grown out of control during Trump's presidency, it has become impossible to be ignorant of the depth and breadth and entrenchment of white supremacy and racism in our country. Today, unless we're living very isolated lives and pay no attention to social media and to the news, we have to either agree that systems favoring white people and holding other races back is the way we believe the natural order of things ought to be, or we're forced to acknowledge that things are way, way out of whack and messed up for everyone but white people in this country. And there are some things that are not so good for white people either, but that's a whole different topic for a different day. For several years now, the availability of video capturing the killings of black people by police and those videos being posted on social media has heightened our awareness. Movements that have arisen, like Black Lives Matter and the Poor People's Campaign, have raised consciousness. We can no longer just avoid knowing about it. blissful ignorance is no longer an option. Now, I don't really need to give you a history lesson today. I did that actually in a sermon a number of years ago when these concepts were newer and information was less accessible, and it was boring, really boring. It was necessary and appreciated, but it was boring, and I'm not going to impose that on you today. We've had lots of opportunities to learn what's going on, to learn our history. And here in this congregation, many of us have been studying these issues and reading about the history of Black lives in America. Through the book group and other programs we've been offering over the past 2 years, we've learned a lot about the entrenchment of laws and policies and procedures that negatively impact people of color, especially Black people, and that privilege white people. I'm impressed with how much we've done here in a short time during a pandemic to raise our own awareness and enlighten ourselves. And we're going to keep on learning and growing and figuring out how to become allies. We're figuring out how to hold our history and hopefully how to contribute to change. Now, I do want to go over just a few concepts, though. Structural or institutional racism, white privilege, and white supremacy. We used to believe that racism was a matter of individual prejudice and the actions that grew out of that prejudice. That's individual racism. Structural or institutional racism has to do with power plus prejudice. Power plus prejudice. Most of us have prejudice of one kind or another, but in this country, the power to institute prejudice into laws and policies has been in white hands. Institutional racism is very much akin to white supremacy. We used to think that white supremacy was only about hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazis. We thought it was only made up of folks who engaged in the brutal treatment of people of color, who believed that white people were indeed superior and that it is the natural order of things to dominate people who are not white. These kinds of groups arose during the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. Those in power, especially in the South, but not exclusively, believed that white people were superior and encouraged hate crimes and hate speech to keep Black people and white sympathizers in their place. And these attitudes were made into laws during Reconstruction, what we know as Jim Crow laws. We've learned much about that in recent years. Many of those laws were so entrenched that even if they've been repealed, which many, many have, we still live very much under their influence. And those of us who have been unaware, whether consciously or unconsciously, have perpetuated that system by our silence. Here's a chart that illustrates white supremacy and how it operates in our country. You can't read it, you don't need to, it's okay. But what you have here is overt white supremacy on one side up high and covert white supremacy on the other side down low. Listed at the top, where overt white supremacy is, listed at the top are lynchings, hate crimes, swastikas, burning crosses, and so on. And then you move a little further down and we see things like hiring discrimination, racist jokes, Make America Great Again, the school to prison pipeline, police brutality, housing discrimination, racial profiling, and so on. And then moving on down into the covert white supremacy part of the chart, we see things like assuming that good intentions are enough, believing we are post-racial, expecting people of color to teach white people, bootstrap theory. But we're just one human family. claiming reverse discrimination or reverse racism. I'm not a racist. I have black friends, not challenging racist jokes and white savior complex. It's up to us to save them. Now, that's the end of the chart. Regardless of where we white folks fall on the spectrum, all of us, the overtly cruel and the covertly unaware, perpetuate the systems that keep white people privileged and people of color having to struggle to catch up or keep up or enjoy the same freedoms and opportunities that white people enjoy in this country. Now, I admit to my own ignorance. I grew up in the Jim Crow South in the 50s and 60s, and I didn't even recognize it. It did seem a little strange to have colored water fountains and white water fountains, black kids sitting in the balcony while white kids sat wherever they wanted to in the movie theaters, black kids not allowed to go to the municipal swimming pool, and only white kids at my school. But no one talked about it in the 50s and 60s where I grew up in Central Florida. It was just the way things were. Well, I married young and left Florida as soon as possible and moved to Maryland, a much bluer state, although not completely blue. And when I started to learn about racism there, I began to learn more about that. But it was pretty elementary. I eventually took some college courses and learned a bit more about systemic racism, but not much. I followed the civil rights movement. We thought it made a difference. We thought it made a huge difference, and it did. Attitudes and opportunities changed, but not enough. I had a good illustration of what we have been taught in America yesterday morning at our small group ministry facilitators monthly meeting. We were using the small group ministry resources from Soul Matters from this month's theme of Holding History. And during the sharing of what each one of us chose to focus on from those materials, one of our facilitators, Tom Dente, talked about his watching the movie The Birth of a Nation 2016 and what he learned in the aftermath of watching that film. The film is about the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831, a revolt of slaves in Southern Virginia, and the killing of 57 white men, women, and children until his capture and execution. Now, Tom wondered why he didn't know about this monumental event, the greatest successful slave rebellion in American history. And so Tom started looking around and trying to figure this out. And he did a lot of research and studying and reading on anything that was describing or dealing with that event. He found his old textbook from his college American history course, The Growth of the American Republic by Morris and Comanger. It had only this to say about the Nat Turner Rebellion. Quote, "The Nat Turner slave insurrection, in which over 50 whites were murdered, occurred in August 1831. Period. End of quote." Nothing more in that history book. Elsewhere in the same textbook, it said that the majority of slaves were adequately fed, well cared for, and happy. That competent observers reported that they performed less labor than the hired men of the northern states. And, quote, "Although brought to America by force, the incurably optimistic Negro soon became attached to his country and devoted to his white folk." End of quote. Now, there were numerous editions of this book. It was a popular textbook for a very long time, published over a number of years. And I don't know which one Tom was using in his college course, but that's what they wanted us to know. That's what they wanted us to believe at that time. And we now know that that isn't true. And many of our fellow citizens and political leaders still want us to believe these kinds of stories about the founding and development of our nation. Right now, nearly half the states have banned or are considering banning the teaching of critical race theory in schools and colleges in their states. They want to suppress any teaching of history that reflects unfavorably on white people, that makes us feel bad or guilty. Now, critical race theory means many different things to many people, and different states are looking at it differently. So, as you know, it's always complex in the United States, where states have different approaches to things. It's a very complex theory taught in universities and graduate schools and law school courses. As a theory, it's not being taught in public schools pretty much anywhere. But opponents of teaching the truth about racism in America are using CRT, critical race theory, as a catchphrase, in some ways as a dog whistle. Now, Florida was an early adopter of the ban on critical race theory, and Florida has defined it as, quote, the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. I'm going to read that again. This is what they're trying to ban in Florida. The theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. In other words, Florida denies the existence of white supremacy and institutional racism. But what Florida denies is demonstrably true. Racism is embedded throughout American society and its legal and financial systems. It does uphold the supremacy of white persons. We know, for example, that there are vast disparities in arrest, conviction, and imprisonment rates, all of which are proportionately much higher for blacks than for whites. We know that black men are far more likely to be stopped for minor traffic violations than anyone else, and that stops are far more likely to result in injury or death. So what about truth? How can structural racism and white supremacy be addressed if its very existence is denied? You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. It appears to that many of our fellow Floridians and fellow Americans don't want to accept or admit this truth. So what do we do about this? How do we hold history? We need to keep learning more of the truth of our history, and we're trying to do that. But we also have to be willing to really face the history that we are learning and not hide from it. We must be willing to awaken from our amnesia. Parker Palmer, the educator, wrote that Jewish teachings include frequent reminders of the importance of the broken, open heart. He retells an old story about a disciple asking his rabbi, "What does Torah tell us? Why does Torah tell us to place these words upon our hearts? Why does it not tell us to place these words in our hearts?" And the rabbi answers, "It is because as we are, our hearts are closed, and we cannot place the holy words in our hearts. So we place them on top of our hearts, and there they stay until one day the heart breaks and the words fall in." Maybe that's the key. The passages from Deuteronomy chapter 11 in the Hebrew Scriptures, Moses is telling the people who are wandering in the wilderness following their exodus from slavery in Egypt to place the 10 Commandments he's received from God on their hearts. According to the story, this is the covenant between God and the Jews. He further instructs them to take the words from their souls, take the words into their souls, and to teach them to their children. Don't we do the same with our 7 principles? These principles are the covenant we affirm as a Unitarian Universalist congregation in covenant with other congregations. It's a more this-worldly covenant than the one God gave to Moses to bring down to the people, but it's no less challenging to live by. We know that we'll never live these principles perfectly, but if we take them seriously, we aspire to bring how we live our lives into ever greater alignment with the principles we affirm. And we do teach them to our children, hopefully by our actions as much as by our words. I think it's like learning to do what we can to overcome racism and white supremacy. We don't have to, you know. Our privilege as white people means we can choose not to worry about it. The disadvantages of the system don't negatively impact us. In fact, we have many favorable advantages. We have the privilege to live in our ignorance. A statement by Jabari S. Jones says, "One thing I've learned is that at the core of white privilege is the entitlement to amnesia and ignorance, to forget that America was founded on stolen land, stolen labor, and genocide, and that we live in a society structured by this history is to embrace an identity rooted in a false innocence and a flight from truth and healing. This," he says, "is the rot at the root of the nation." Yes, we can ignore it. Yes, we can live with amnesia. But can we live with ourselves? We used to be ignorant, limited by what we were taught. But once we started to learn how deep and how wide and how destructive to the soul of our nation white supremacy is, it's very, very difficult to return to not knowing. We are called to place what we're learning on our hearts and keep placing more and more as we learn more and more on our hearts until our hearts break and the words fall in. May we be so brave. So may it be. Amen. Our closing hymn this morning is number 1017, Building a New Way, verses 1, 2, and 4. Our closing words are also from the young man I quoted earlier. Before his inauguration as the 46th president, Joe Biden memorialized 400,000 U.S. deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic, saying, "To heal, we must remember. It's hard sometimes to remember, but that's how we heal. It's important to do that as a nation." So, my prayer is for myself as well as for this country at a crossroads. May we remember the wounds of the past that bleed into the present so that we may heal and grow into the future together, whole and wise. May we remember and be free at last. Let us take these words with us as we go today and until we meet again. Amen.